Hello, I'm Father Joseph Fessio, S.J., founder and editor of Ignatius Press, and I'm here with Vivian Dudu, our senior editor, to talk about a book which surprised us all. We get many, many manuscripts over the years of different types. We got one which seemed like it might be kind of an academic book for a very limited number of readers, but we were surprised by it, and it looks like it's much more important than we originally thought. But Vivian, would you tell us kind of the history of how we got this manuscript?
It was one of those unsolicited manuscripts, and it was based on doctoral research, and that's always usually a big no.
Right.
And but as we started reading it, we realized that there was a lot of valuable information in there, previously unknown to all of us, and so we figured probably to a lot of other people too. So we contacted the author, and there you go.
But what was it about?
It was about the American betrayal of President Diem, who was the president of South Vietnam in the early years of the Vietnam War. And what we didn't know was that he was well, we knew he had been an ally of the United States, but what we didn't realize was the central role the Kennedy administration played in his betrayal and murder. And the author, who's a counterinsurgency expert, not really a biographer, he shows how he chronicles the events that lead up to his betrayal and shows how the war effort was actually being won at that time. And so some people posit that his death actually led to the loss of the war.
And what's the standard narrative on the assassination of President Diem of Vietnam?
Well, the standard narrative begins with portraying Diem as a tyrannical despot who persecuted the Buddhists of Vietnam, who cracked down on any political dissent, and the man doesn't have a good bone in his body, according to most historical accounts that you would find easily. And what Professor Shaw, who is the author of the book, shows is that there's a whole nother Diem that few of us know. He was a Third Order Benedictine, a daily communicant, a devout Catholic. He did more to encourage Buddhism in Vietnam than any previous leader because the Buddhist tradition had been neglected during French rule. And he had more Buddhists in his army and cabinet and so on than he had Catholics. And he was fighting a counterinsurgency against the Viet Cong. And so he did use martial law kind of authority because he was fighting a war. But the American press at that time, you have to remember this was during the Civil Rights era in the United States, so there was this keen emphasis on human rights and liberties and so on. And so he was harshly judged in the court of American opinion. And this put tremendous pressure on the Kennedy administration.
Even with all this, one might ask, and we asked ourselves, well, so what? I mean, we'll go back to this historical period and kind of see what happened, maybe set the record straight. But it became clear and clear to us how relevant this is because it relates to American foreign policy, especially in circumstances where we want to have a democratic government to support. And if we find a dictator or someone we think is a dictator, we work with those opposing that dictator to help install what we believe will be a more democratic form of government. And that's happening today. It happened in the last few years. It's happened in Iraq. It's happened in Afghanistan. It's happening in Syria. And what we found as we read this manuscript was that the same mistakes are being made now that were made then. And remember that Diem was assassinated in a terribly brutal way only because the green light was given by the American government by JFK, right?
Yes, the president himself ordered the coup. And that didn't necessarily mean Diem's murder, but I think anyone who understood the situation in Vietnam could not have been surprised by his brutal murder on All Souls Day, by the way, and he was apprehended at a Catholic church.
Yeah, and after Mass in the Shrine of Our Lady outside the church.
Yes, and his brother also was murdered with him.
Right, and he had another brother who was the Archbishop of Hue. So his family was a noble family in Vietnam, very well connected. And you know, Vietnam is a long, thin country, going from north to south, and on its western border you have Laos, which is also long, somewhat thin, and is connected to China. And so one of the things that happened was that the U.S. government was trying to be as neutral as possible, and they wanted to accept Laos as a neutral country, even though it was infested with Viet Minh, or
Viet Cong is what they later became
later
known
became
as.
Viet Cong, and it was a route down from North Vietnam and the communists through Laos. They could then, through 3 passes, get into Vietnam and South Vietnam. And so
This, by the way, is the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which I'm sure many listeners and readers will recall that term.
And so, first of all, President Diem was very upset that this the United States should recognize Laos as a neutral, and it's being used basically as a supply line for these rebel troops coming in, guerrilla troops, to stir up dissent and confusion in the people. And so, of course, Diem had to be somewhat autocratic because he was fighting a war, as Vivian says, and there were, what do the communists try and do but try and incite revolution and rebellion and dissatisfaction? But the fact is, from all the research this man did, Diem was very, very popular with the people. He'd go out into the countryside. He had a plan called the Secure Hamlet.
Strategic Hamlet Program.
Secure Hamlet or strategic?
Strategic
Hamlet
Hamlet Program.
Because what the Viet Cong would do was they'd come and infiltrate all these villages and turn the people against the legitimate government and trying to impose communism. Well, Diem's view was, if we can have these hamlets, these small villages, secure and link a network of them, that will be a way of overcoming this incursion we're having from North Vietnam. And also, he felt, and rightly so, that the best way to protect these hamlets was not to have a foreign army there, because then you're subject to the objection, oh, you people are just oppressed by a foreign...
You're a puppet of a foreign government.
You're a puppet of a foreign government. So he wanted police forces in there made up of local people with support from American and foreign troops to set this up, but to leave the maintenance of these hamlets to local police forces that were trained properly by Americans and others. And
which, by the way, would lead to authentic democratic government.
Exactly.
In other words, if these villages were to become self-governing, their own defense systems and so on, that would become the practice of democracy on the local level. So it's not as though the Diem government was contra democracy. It's just they wanted to have it grow organically through different methods from what the U.S. government was insisting upon. So that's a good segue into the point you made before, Father, about American foreign policy continuing this pattern of thinking that we can change a country by, first of all, getting rid of the top guy and sending in a foreign army. And we keep seemingly repeating this pattern of problem solving, and it doesn't look as though we've been terribly successful at it.
No, and I will admit that Muammar Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein and Bashar al-Assad are not daily communicant Catholics like President Diem was.
Not at all.
But here we had a leader who was truly a noble man, well beloved by his people, well connected. He'd been heavily involved in the independence of Vietnam. It was
From French rule.
From French rule and French Indochina. And so he was greatly respected by his people. But with these incursions of the guerrilla forces from the Viet Cong, I mean, he had to be a strong man too. But he didn't do executions, mass executions, or those kinds of things you hear about from these other dictators. So really, when you realize who he was and what he did, I mean, he's really, ought to be up for canonization. I mean, as a great Catholic and a great leader.
A Catholic statesman. And ironically, his Catholic side is what made Kennedy, in the end, pull the rug out from under him, because President Kennedy, as a Catholic, had difficult time proving to the American people that he wasn't being governed by his faith in his decisions. And Diem's Catholic faith was being used to convince Kennedy that if he were in support of an autocratic Catholic leader, that people would assume it was he'd turned a blind eye because of the Catholic faith. And so it's a really terrible tragedy that happened. And interestingly enough, Kennedy, a few months later, was assassinated himself. And so it reads, you learn history, you learn military strategy, you learn this human drama, this sweeping sort of epic human drama of events with tragic endings. And so it's a good read.
Right, and you also learn about some really heroic Americans that you can be proud of. Frederick Nolting
The ambassador
was
to
the
Vietnam.
ambassador. He got there in May 9th, I think, in 1961. He understood Southeast Asia. He understood Diem. He understood American politics, and he continually tried to support Diem, but he was countered in Washington, D.C. by this group of people around Kennedy who were concerned about Diem being a Catholic, concerned about it not being a totally democratic rule. And so Nolting was unsuccessful, but when you read about all he did, flying to Washington, D.C., you know, for professional meetings, talking to others, inviting people to Vietnam, it was really a heroic life he lived, trying to do the right thing. And what was the result of this horrible mistake in foreign policy? 10 years of war that tore up the United States of America. Well, we've never been the same after that war.
That's right.
And how many lost their lives in that war?
50,000 American
Lost their
casualties.
lives. And it was winning before that. I mean, South Vietnam was winning the battle for hearts, the battle for territory. I believe half of the population was in these hamlets.
A good percentage of them were, yes.
Half.
Well, okay.
Because I believe it was 9
Father's good on the numbers.
9 million out of 18 million or 7 million, whatever it was, the population, I think it was 18 million, 9 million was in the hamlets. So it was really tremendously successful. But there's another aspect of this is the American media. You see, they were the ones
Yes.
that filtered the story. They had people that were journalists in Vietnam that talked to other journalists. They did not go out in the countryside like Diem did. They talked to the people in the
In
cities.
Saigon, mostly.
In
They're
Saigon.
in a hotel. Yeah,
So
that's
anyway, so you see, what happens, we get this huge manuscript. It seems like it's only of historical interest based on a doctoral thesis or doctoral work. We begin reading it and we realize this is an important book. It's an important book, first of all, to set the record straight for a wonderful Catholic statesman, but even more so for reflecting on what our policy should be now and going forward for the good of our country, but also for the good of these other countries we're trying to support.
which is why we've gotten some fine endorsements. For
Yes.
example, Admiral Poindexter
Yep.
and a man who served in the National Security Council during that time. And it was really gratifying to see, because we thought we were sort of going out on a limb. Father Shaw, it's been gratifying to see some fine men say that this is a
Yes,
good
Father
book.
Shaw, we sent the manuscript to him to get an endorsement. He actually wrote such a long endorsement, we made it the preface of the book. It's so beautiful. By the way, we should say, this book is called The Lost Mandate of Heaven. And why is it called The Lost Mandate of Heaven?
Because this was a Confucian idea that a true leader of the people is actually chosen by heaven, and that he will be manifested by his personal virtue, by his dedication and love of his people, and so on. And that this mandate, the thesis of the book, is that this mandate was not lost by behavior on the part of Diem, but rather taken from him by the U.S. government.
Right, and the key there is that it was part of that culture to believe that you could only respect a leader who had that mandate from heaven.
Right.
And
exactly.
they believed that Diem had it. And after the military coup, with different people fighting each other, the way they massacred him, the people could not possibly believe that this government had the mandate from heaven. So that's why it's called The Lost Mandate of Heaven. You're going to want to read this, very important. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.